Idealism and Spacetime, Relativistic Constraints on Interface between Mind and Physical Construct within Mental Monism by Peter B. Lloyd. Where are you? Do you think you're inside one of these? Do you think those are electrical signals you're seeing now? To answer that question, we will look at some theories of how the mind might be embedded in physical matter. Then we'll need some tools from relativity theory, namely the unity of space-time and the relativity of temporal sequence. Then we have two thought experiments, the buzzer experiment and the flashbang experiment. Finally, we will look at the implications for non-local minds. What does it even mean to say that your conscious mind is inside a physical brain? There are many ways to imagine that your conscious experiences are literally in the brain tissue, that all of your thoughts and emotions and memories are there inside that piece of matter. The class of identity theories assert that conscious mental events are, in some sense or another, physical events, that they are supervenient on physical events or inside physical events. The leading theory nowadays is Panpsychism. According to this, the basic elements of reality have as their extrinsic properties the physical attributes that are familiar to us, but that their intrinsic or interior properties are mental. Now let's look at the first of the tools that we're going to need from relativity theory. According to relativity theory, two events such as these have a certain distance in time and space for one observer, but different distances in time and space for an observer in a different inertial frame. Only the space-time interval, as shown by the yellow arrow, is constant for all observers. As Minkowski said in 1908, henceforth space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away into mere shadows, and only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent reality. The interdependence of time and space is governed by Einstein's equations of relativity, which, as I shall argue, place a certain constraint on how the mind can interact with the physical world. Since time and space are interlinked in this way, we come to our first philosophical tool. If two events are located in an interval of physical time, then they must also be located in a volume of physical space. We can illustrate the interdependence of time and space with this diagram. The vertical axis is time, the horizontal axis is distance, and there are two events, blue and red, which occur at the same time in this inertial frame of reference. An observer traveling at high velocity in relation to the first frame of reference defines a new frame, which is indicated by drawing the vertical axis at an angle. Planes of simultaneity are defined perpendicular to each axis, and now we see in the moving frame of reference the red event occurs before the blue event, and an observer traveling at high velocity in the opposite direction defines a third inertial frame of reference. In this case, the blue event occurs before the red. This brings us to the second philosophical tool. If two events are space-like separated, the order in which they happen is not absolute, but is relative to the observer. This is, of course, massively counterintuitive, as we normally assume that the order in which things happen is the same for everyone. Armed with those two philosophical tools, we will now examine two thought experiments, beginning with the buzzer. The experiment is very simple. A buzzer sounds, and the subject presses a button. Of course, what is of interest is the conscious mental event that occurs between the buzzer and the button press. In relativity theory, the buzzer and the button define 2 points in space-time, which, as we have seen, also entail a spatial interval, which depends upon the observer. In Michael Lockwood's thought experiment, we can make the buzzer and the button arbitrarily close in time, and hence arbitrarily close in space. Lockwood's argument is as follows. First, the conscious thought must come after the buzz and before the button press. Therefore, the conscious thought must occur within the interval of physical time between buzz and button press. But according to our first philosophical tool, space and time are inextricable in space-time. Therefore, the conscious thought must occur within the interval of physical space between the buzz and the button press. In fact, this argument is wrong because it has a circular premise. Saying that the conscious thought occurs after the buzz already assumes the conscious thought is in physical space-time. You cannot prove that a conscious thought is in physical space-time by presupposing that it is in physical time. What really happens is that in physical space-time, the buzzer buzzes, the synapses fire, the button is pressed. But in mental time, you experience the buzz, you make a decision, and act to press a button. Mental time proceeds through a succession of moments of experience. The relationship between mental time and physical time is an open question. What we can say, however, is that relativity theory applies only to third-person observable events in space and time. Mental experiences, however, are not third-person observable, so relativity theory cannot apply to conscious minds. Therefore, Lockwood's argument does not go through. I know what you're thinking. Surely mental experiences must map onto the physical events. Surely this is obvious. But how could you ever verify this? By stepping outside your experiences and peering directly into the physical world? The only possible external verification would be another mind. Within the realm of mental time, there is at least a fact of the matter how one stream of experiences maps to another, even if there's no practicable way of measuring it. Let's sum up where we've got to. The first philosophical tool says that if two events are located in an interval of physical time, then they must also be located in a volume of physical space. So Michael Lockwood's buzzer argument claims that mental experiences are therefore situated in physical space-time. But we found that argument was faulty because it rests on a circular premise. Now the second philosophical tool says that if two events are space-like separated, the order in which they happen is not absolute, but is relative to the observer. Which leads us to the big brain argument, which says that consciousness cannot be embedded in extended brain tissue. Now I'm going to invoke a general rule that scientific principles have universal application. They don't work just on Tuesday afternoons or only in London. For example, gravity applies in the same way for apples and planets. Now, since Panpsychism locates consciousness in the intrinsic properties of pieces of matter, it will apply the same whether the nerve cells are physically close together or spread out. Just as a thought experiment, imagine stretching out the neurons so they are space-like separated. Now, Panpsychism says we can do this because consciousness is the intrinsic content of these pieces of matter. But how big would the brain have to be for the neuronal spikes to be space-like separated? It would have to be the size of the solar system. Yes, I know this is obviously absurd, but just as gravity works as well for planets and apples, Panpsychism should work as well for giant brains. So let's see how the flash-bang experiment works. The two events are a flash, which is registered in the occipital visual part of the brain, and a bang registered in the parietal auditory part of the brain. Whether these two events are caused by electrical stimulation of nerve tissue or have arrived through sense organs doesn't really make any difference to the experiment. These two experiences will be set up in such a way that it is indubitable which one happens first. So the subject will experience the flash and then the bang, maybe an hour later or whenever. Now, for some observers traveling at high velocity in relation to the original reference frame, will find that the events happen in the reverse order, that the bang happens first and then the flash. Obviously, this is a contradiction. We can summarize the argument as follows. First, we have two experiences, a flash and a bang, which are sufficiently distant in time, an hour, a day, whenever, that their order is indubitable. Now, if panpsychism is true, then the experiences of the flash and the bang inhere in the relevant bits of brain tissue, even if they are space-like separated as they are in our giant brain. According to relativity theory, in particular our second philosophical tool, space-like separated events do not have an absolute temporal sequence. One of the events may occur before the other, depending upon the observer's inertial reference frame. But that is a contradiction of our premise that the sequence in which these two experiences occur is indubitable. Therefore, panpsychism as such must be false. Of course, we could add extra criteria to the theory of panpsychism, such as limiting it to human-sized brains, but then it wouldn't be panpsychism anymore. This is not just about panpsychism. The argument applies to any theory that tries to make conscious experiences inhere locally in the substance of brain tissue, or the causal structure, or the information processing. But the argument does not defeat theories that make the conscious mind a non-local entity with correlations in brain tissue. So we've looked at the theories, the tools, the experiments, and now we're going to look at the ramifications for non-local minds. As we all know, relativity theory forbids faster-than-light communication. But if conscious minds are non-local, then there is a risk that they could communicate superluminally. After all, what is to stop a non-local mind on Earth from communicating with a non-local mind on Mars? You may be thinking that isn't this a bit like non-local quantum entanglement? Well, it's crucially different. Quantum mechanics allows two particles to have a non-local entanglement, but it does not allow superluminal communication. Quantum measurements on the particles are non-locally correlated, but cannot transmit cause and effect non-locally. We need a similar constraint on non-local minds, otherwise we are in big trouble. Let's pause for a moment and see why superluminal communication is so terrible. Now, suppose we had a tachyon phone, a device that allows us to communicate faster than the speed of light. Then two high-velocity spacecraft could communicate superluminally and create a causal loop. Imagine two very fast spacecraft, the Apollo and the Artemis, flying off in different directions. At time t3, Apollo calls Artemis on a tachyon phone. Now, because of time dilation, in other words, time is slowing down in Artemis, as seen from Apollo, this message arrives at time t2, earlier than t3. As soon as Artemis receives this message, she sends a message back to Apollo telling her to stop with the nuisance calls via the tachyon phone. Now, the funny thing about time dilation is that it works both ways. So from Artemis' point of view, time has slowed down in Apollo, and so when Artemis sends a message via the tachyon phone, it arrives at time t1 earlier than t2. So Apollo gets the message at t1 saying, don't send any messages, hence the original message at t3 doesn't get sent, and we have a causal loop, a paradox. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that non-local minds can communicate directly. The thoughts between these non-local minds don't traverse any intervening space, so it would be a kind of instantaneous thought transference. But that yields a causal loop, just like the tachyon phone did. To illustrate this, we can imagine Apollo sending a telepathic signal at T3, which arrives at T2 Artemis, and she then sends a signal to Apollo, arriving at T1, and bingo, we have a causal loop again. We have to drill down into the concepts. What does instantaneous actually mean? Well, physically, a message sent at time t3 arrives at the Lorentz-dilated time t2. Mentally, time would be measured in, I suppose, discrete conscious moments. So a message sent at time t3 arrives at the so-called proper time t3. In other words, each conscious observer has a mental time chugging along at the same rate of moments of experience. Let's try to get clearer about this by looking at a detailed example. At time t3 equals 10 hours into the flight, Apollo calculates that because of time dilation, Artemis is only 5 hours, t3 over 2, into her flight. The telepathic message arrives at t3 in Artemis, which is physically in Apollo's future. At time t3, Artemis calculates, because of time dilation, that Apollo is at 5 hours, t3 over 2, into his flight. So the message must have originated in Artemis's physical future. Artemis takes delta minutes to think and sends her telepathic message back at t3 plus delta, which arrives instantly at time t3 plus delta at Apollo. Both Apollo and Artemis believe they are communicating with their counterpart in the physical future, which is the mental present. This is possible because mental time and physical time are decoupled, and there is a universal mental time. Conclusions. First, Lockwood's argument that conscious minds must be in physical space because time and space are interlinked in space-time does not hold. On the contrary, for any theory that embeds the mind locally in the brain, the relativity of temporal sequence for space-like separated events contradicts the indubitable ordering of mental events, so the mind cannot be in the brain. Finally, instantaneous communication between non-local minds would not violate the relativistic ban on superluminal communication, as it would be instantaneous in mental time, not physical time. The foregoing arguments indicate that the conscious mind must be non-local. The motivation for this whole line of inquiry is that there are strong philosophical grounds to support mental monism, otherwise known as idealism. This is the theory that reality comprises only conscious minds. Of course, in mental monism, the mind is a fortiori non-local. The foregoing arguments thus provide an account of how the mind interfaces with a relativistic
Hello, everyone. I am Seymen Atasoy from the Eastern Mediterranean University in North Cyprus. My talk for today is entitled Idealism in Consciousness Studies, Dominant Cultural Narratives and Social Change. My starting point is the existence of the enduring puzzles in science, such as why is there still no generally accepted materialist explanations for consciousness, the quantum anomalies of the last 100 years, the mind-body problem, and the heart problem. Another puzzling situation is the long-standing stagnation in social sciences, and especially in more recent times, irrational developments in politics and society are taking place, for which there are, as of yet, no satisfying explanations. Also, it may be worth at this stage to remember that Newtonian physics is the original model for social science, and this brings to mind the question, is materialism causing stagnation in social science disciplines? An important clarification is necessary to distinguish political and ethical idealism from philosophical or metaphysical idealism. These are two different views. In politics, the word idealism etymologically was made up from ideals, whereas in philosophy, actually the important root word is ideas. And these are two very different approaches. If you look at the Cambridge Dictionary, for instance, ideal is defined as perfect or the best possible thing or situation. And this could be anything and could be used to justify, for example, genocide, to attain the ideal of racial purity if somebody defines his or her ideal as racism or racist. Whereas in philosophy, of course, idealism refers to a situation where ideas, mind, or consciousness is the ground of all being, and everything else, including matter, is derivative of it. And can there be a political idealism without metaphysics? Of course, that shouldn't be the case, but oftentimes political idealists don't define their metaphysical fundamental principles not very clearly. Their assumptions are not very clearly articulated. So political and ethical idealists should clarify their metaphysical position and remain consistently loyal to it. One example here in this screen, we have the paper by Cameron Thies assessing the realist-idealist debate in international relationships. And the argument here is that this realist-idealist debate, which is in a way reminiscent of the materialist-idealist debate in a way, but of course different, but there is some overlapping points here. This debate was framed by the realists, not by the idealists themselves, according to this argument, but by the realists who constructed a unified idealism temporarily located in the interwar period to be the straw man for the justification of their own theories and the starting point for the construction of the realist identity. Another distinction we need to make is the distinction between rational actors and conscious actors. A lot of social science makes the rational actor assumption. In economics, economic actors are rational utility maximizers. Corporations are rational profit maximizers. In international relations, states are rational power maximizers. And but instead of a rational actor, if the more important actor is the conscious actor, then that's much more difficult to define, and it's much more difficult to predict the behavior of a conscious actor because it's not just intelligence, but there are emotions in consciousness and memories, and qualia have unpredictable effects sometimes on conscious actors. So perhaps this is one of the shortcomings of social sciences, because these rational choice models based on expected utility often disappoint. Especially in more recent times, we have a lot of irrational developments in especially politics, with authoritarian populism manipulating the emotions of angry and resentful masses for their own political interests. And there is also a long-standing dissatisfaction with materialism and a search for alternatives in social sciences. During the last 30 years, we had these competing paradigms: post-positivism, interpretivism, reflexivism, social constructivism, etc. But still, realism, more materialistic realism, remains the dominant paradigm and discourse in social sciences in general. And social sciences are also quite conservative and resistant to change. Here is an example whereby the American Political Science Association president of the 1920s calls upon his colleagues to decipher and integrate the insights from the quantum revolution and apply it to the social sciences, but this request doesn't take place until recently, whereby an eminent political scientist, Alexander Wendt, applied the quantum paradigm and panpsychism to social science and started a lively debate. His book came out from Cambridge University Press in 2015. If we assess the situation by using Thomas Kuhn's cycle for the scientific revolutions, we see that if at all, we are at the very beginning stages of a potential paradigm change in science. So a lot of modesty is called for. Materialism is still very strong. Some examples of recent initiatives for post-materialist science. In the United States, a group of university professors and scholars, scientists announced the manifesto for a post-materialist science to overcome the constraints of materialism. And it's also important that they note that compassion, respect, and peace, as well as environmental awareness and the preservation of our biosphere, are actually associated with an idealistic or idealist vision. From the United Kingdom, we have an example of the Galileo Commission report, Beyond the Materialist Worldview Towards an Expanded Science. They call for expanding science so that it can accommodate and explore important human experiences and questions that science in its present form is unable to integrate. Another noteworthy academic is Bernarda Kastrup, who's got 2 PhDs in computer science and philosophy, and he has been publishing both in academic journals, but also at the same time he's been publishing books appealing to the general public. So I call Kastrup and others like him dual track scholars that both appeal to the general public as well as the scientific community. And also Kastrup gave me the idea regarding the importance of cultural narratives, because he claims that he would like to change the cultural narrative by defending philosophical or metaphysical idealism. His version he calls analytic idealism. A dominant cultural narrative is an explanation or story that is told in service of the dominant social group's interests and ideologies. Because dominant narratives are so normalized through their repetition and authority, they have the illusion of being objective and apolitical, when in fact they are neither. Here is a small sketch that shows how cultural narratives shape our lens of meaning through which we gaze at the world and interpret the reality around ourselves. A political science argument concerning the importance of cultural differences is here presented as an example. Samuel Huntington, the late political scientist from Harvard University, published his books and papers on the clash of civilizations in the 1990s and afterwards, after the end of the Cold War, and he argued that after the end of ideological conflict with the end of Cold War, civilizations and civilizational differences would be the source of future conflict in world politics. Other than cultural identities, There are also different collective identities based on nationalism, ethnicity, race, ideology, and historical enmity, and serve as major sources of conflict in domestic and international politics, genocide, war, populism, etc. And idealism is likely to moderate conflictual identity politics and support cooperation by expanding collective identities towards the whole of existence and by instilling long-term thinking. The importance of having a long-term perspective was emphasized by Robert Axelrod. He used evolutionary game theory to explain the importance of what he calls the shadow of the future, having a long time perspective to stabilize cooperation. Idealism extends the time horizon of humans infinitely. In fact, perhaps this could be called the secularization of immortality and oneness. So basically, the argument is natural science influences both social science and cultural narrative, and a social science influenced by natural science also influences cultural narrative, and a change in cultural narrative is likely to bring about change in the actual social, political, economic order. Expanded science is also likely to moderate and help resolve the ongoing conflict between secularism and religion. Although there is a decline, global decline of religion in general during the last decade, still religion is tenacious, and the idealist interpretation of reality actually threatens not only materialists but fundamentalist religions also. So both atheists, materialists, as well as the fundamentalist religionists are likely to oppose idealism. In fact, they already do that. Famous historian Yuval Noah Harari here defines religion as a deal and spirituality as a journey. And also it's worth to keep in mind that organized religion is often dominated by the state or voluntarily collaborates with it, serving centralization of power within the society at the expense of individuals, whereas spirituality is based on direct experience rather than officially sanctioned scripture and clergy, and is less open to political and economic manipulation by existing and would-be leaders. I mentioned this distinction between religion and spirituality because philosophical idealism, at least implicitly, supports spirituality, but not religion. Not so much religion. In fact, contradicts, religion, because oftentimes, especially the monotheistic religions, Western religions, are dualistic between a God in heavens and sinful humans here on this planet, and there is this duality, whereas spirituality is often based on non-duality or oneness, and also idealism calls for a oneness of consciousness as the ground of all being. Here is a recent statistical piece showing the decline of religion. Of course, we have to keep in mind it still remains to be an important social force. Briefly, let's look at some examples for academic receptivity to and desire for a new worldview reminiscent of idealism. Two Duke University psychologists published this paper, The Psychological Implications of Believing That Everything is One. Their research is based on survey research, and in two studies they found that believing in oneness was associated with having an identity that includes distal people and the natural world, feeling connected to humanity and nature, and having values that focus on other people's welfare. That sounds pretty good in terms of cooperation and pro-social behavior. Another study from prestigious journal Millennium International Relations calls for an idealist vision for world politics. And here some psychologists from University of Arizona and Harvard University call for a post-materialist psychology, and ecological economics published this article exploring worldviews and their relationship to sustainable lifestyles also calling for an idealist vision. These were just some examples. However, there are also major risks if idealism becomes popular too rapidly and in an unbalanced manner. I have seen a lot of studies in the literature defending the benefits of idealism for human civilization, but I haven't seen any warnings that it may have also certain unexpected and harmful consequences if it comes to dominate the cultural narrative too rapidly and in an unbalanced way. Because if consumption drops too abruptly in a capitalist society, the economy will collapse, unemployment will rise, food distribution may be disrupted, and social disorder may ensue. If only some groups within a society or only some countries in the global system adopt idealism as a guide to behavior, they will face the risk of subjugation, exploitation, and conquest by others still aggressively materialistic. After all, let's keep in mind, politics is a power game. Potential losers and potential winners, whenever you have them associated with change, expect the conflict. There will be continued resistance to idealism by those who stand to lose their privileged positions due to post-materialist ontologies, especially within the scientific establishment, but also in the economy, business, politics, and culture. This will permit only a gradual paradigm change in science and a still slower process of culture change in the broader society. On the other hand, the renaissance in psychedelic research and the mindfulness movement are two key accelerators of a potential acceptance of post-materialism. The spread of a consciousness-only ontology will increase pro-social behavior and cooperation, but there will be powerful losers, such as authoritarian states, centralized religions, many businesses and workers, consumers, and anyone engaged in the production and sale of non-vital goods and services. States will worry about their declining tax revenues and recruitment to their armies of patriotic citizens ready to kill and die. Companies need obedient employees and acquisitive customers to maximize their profits. I mean, of course, the argument behind these observations here is if the overall culture becomes more idealist, they will emphasize less material consumption, and maybe they will focus on exploration of their inner selves and maybe embark upon searches for meaning instead of just maximizing their income and focusing on material consumption. Here is a brief sketch showing the structure of a cultural narrative, and some examples are given from the environmental movement as well as the so-called MAGA narrative, Make America Great Again. So these are some examples, but once the dominant narrative is destabilized by competing narratives, that's another stage to be careful, because it's not assured that a progressive outcome will come from the destabilization of the dominant narrative. Another one supporting the status quo may emerge, and worse yet, a more regressive narrative may also emerge. An example from Finland, Erkka Laininen. So I have to rush a little bit time-wise, but she shows us that if you want to change the worldview, you have to focus on metaphysics and cosmology, which is at the basis. And also she criticizes the worldview in Western culture, atomistic and mechanistic, fragmented, positivistic and reductionist conception of knowledge and sciences, emphasis on material production and consumption, economic growth, globalization, and the like. And she comes from a more ecological, socialist perspective, and she presents here the dominant cultural narrative and her proposed new cultural narrative. She proposes things like we should shift from material consumption, individualism, and a focus on on the needs of our generation, to non-material consumption, sharing and caring, needs of future generations, and the like. So to conclude, in the last couple minutes I have, currently post-materialism remains to be a marginal position in natural and social science, despite growing interest in it. Being closer to materialism, panpsychism seems to be more acceptable to mainstream scientists than idealism is. Unless major new anomalies weaken materialism, a paradigm shift to post-materialism in science remains to be a long-term prospect at best. Rather than a monolithic paradigm shift, more diversity and pluralism leading to gradual change in science is more realistic and perhaps more preferable, as long as it's not too late for such a change. The COVID-19 pandemic has so far raised societal respect for mainstream sciences, especially the health-related ones. On the other hand, ecological decline, economic disparities, increasing conflict, the crisis of meaning, and other ills increase public demand for a viable alternative to materialism. Given the survey results confirming global decline of religion, public demand for a meaningful secular worldview is likely to increase. Scientists with a dual-track approach of communicating with the general public through popular writing and social media, while at the same time publishing scientific work, are highly impactful. If idealism smoothly becomes the next dominant cultural narrative of human civilization before it causes its own demise, it may help humanity to avoid further clashes of civilizations, overcome the ongoing and harmful conflict between secularism and religion, effectively respond to the rapidly deepening ecological crisis, reduce wars and other types of violence, increase international cooperation in many issue areas to create a better world and create harmonious, egalitarian, and meaningful societies, maximizing human wellness and growth, while reducing crime, corruption, and exploitation. One warning here, there are fake and dangerous political idealists because, as we said, the political ideal can be anything that is assumed to be so. Corrupt and anti-democratic power elites legitimize their rule by ideology, religion, dynasty, or defense against imaginary enemies, which they present as ideals and prey upon their own societies. Authoritarian and parasitic populist leaders and their supporters falsely claim to be democratic and to represent the interests of masses, while actually deceiving and exploiting them. Religionists frequently cause sectarian and antagonistic divisions of societies while abusing the ideals of their religion as cover. Racists attack minorities in the name of their ideal of racial purity. Nationalists suppress ethnic minorities in the name of national unity. And imperialists seek to capture and exploit resources of foreign countries in the name of glory and grandeur. Finally, recommendations are: ethical, sociological, and political idealists should double-check and clarify their own understanding, their own underlying metaphysical assumptions. Harmony with metaphysical idealism can serve as a criterion by which the depth of ethical and political idealism is assessed. Primary ethical political principles metaphysical idealism implies are: 1. Respect for oneness of being, subscribe to nonviolence and seek to eradicate violence everywhere, uphold human rights, ecological stewardship, animal rights, biodiversity, etc. And 2, don't divide human communities at any level from local to global in the name of race, gender, religion, sect, nationalism, ethnocentrism, ideology, etc. So beware of opportunistic political leaders pretending to be idealists but grossly contradicting metaphysical idealism. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll appreciate if you have some comments or suggestions for me. My email address is indicated on this slide, and I wish all of you a very nice conference, dear friends. Have a good life, and may all beings be happy.
Hello, I'm Craig DeLancey, professor of philosophy at the State University of New York at Oswego. And thank you for watching this presentation, which is on the consciousness, on the idea of consciousness as sampling of an information-dense environment. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint slides here so I can share those with you. And we can go over the argument together. The argument I'm going to make today concerns or is in the context of an ongoing project where I've been arguing that phenomenal experiences appear mysterious to us because they are enormously complex information states or information events. And I call that the complexity of consciousness claim. So to give us context today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing that. But my main task today is to talk about this idea that phenomenal experiences are enormously complex information states. And there's sort of two aspects to that. On the one hand, there's the perception of the environment, the information in a perceptual experience. And then there's also the sampling that goes on in consciousness. You probably are familiar with the workspace theory of consciousness. This is a theory I find compelling and think is likely true. Proposed by Bars first, I believe. And this is a theory that that access consciousness, the consciousness that you and I can report upon, is a kind of sampling of our perceptual information and other kinds of information that our mind has. And so the access consciousness is the kind of workspace where this information can rise up, be shared with other functional aspects of the mind. And in that theory, then, consciousness is a kind of sampling. And why would, and there's also the question then, my claim is going to be that the sampling is very, very complex. So we have the joint question, why would phenomenal experiences, perceptual experiences, say, be high information states? And also then, why would this sample of them be? Why wouldn't it just be a trivially, low information sample that you just take of your perceptual experience? So both of those are sort of mysterious. Why would that be? And today I'm going to defend those claims or explain why that would be. And that's a sort of two-step explanation. One is I'll make an argument about how competition between organisms that have representational systems puts pressure on them to have ever more rich information collection from the environment and also sampling by consciousness so that they can make decisions. And that's occurring in the context of a world that is information dense. So there's sort of a functionally no limit on, practically, let's say, no limit on, or physically would be the best way to put it, physically no limit on the upper bound, let's say, of the possible information that might be useful. There are practical limitations, and the organism has to pay for that representation, and that's costly. But it's not the case that the environment has an upper bound, right? It's just so complex and then more complex. So I'll defend that today, and it might, hopefully it'll be useful to you in your own research in that it could give you a different way of thinking about consciousness and also representations of the environment. So again, the context here, this, you should be wary that you've been using this word complex a lot, and you're probably well aware that it gets used in many, many, many different ways. And so there's profound ambiguities here. But I'm using the term throughout this talk. Whenever I say complex, I am referring to descriptive complexity, also sometimes called Kolmogorov complexity. And this is meant to be a measure of how compactly we can describe something. Perhaps the most intuitive way to describe descriptive complexity is to say the descriptive complexity of a description D is the size of the shortest computer program that can print D. So that's a very nicely intuitive way of putting it. We don't need computers to be able to describe descriptive complexity, but we're all familiar with them. And so it's a nice way of putting it. And I think you're all familiar with running out of space on your hard drive because you have so many pictures or videos. And that's because you couldn't squeeze that information more. Now we're talking about descriptive complexity. Here's an intuitive way to think about it. Here's an example that many textbooks on descriptive complexity use. I don't know who first originated it, but it's a beautifully elegant example. My variation on it. Here I have two 200-bit strings. One of these I made up, and the other I created with, flipping handfuls of coins over and over. Once I tell you that, everybody gets that I made up the first one, and the second one comes from the coin toss. But that's rather mysterious in a way, because they're both equally likely to occur in 200 coin tosses, according to classical statistics. What's going on here? Well, from the perspective of descriptive complexity, what's going on is, I'm an organism, I'm lazy, I don't want to spend too much time and energy. So if I could just take some shortcut, a simple algorithm that will allow me to produce a string, I'll use that. And that's what I did in the first case. I just wrote 0, 100 times. The second string was costly because I had to go through these coin tosses. In terms of descriptive complexity, what that means is that first string number 1 there, has very little information. It's not descriptively complex because a very short program, basically a program that says print 0, 1 100 times, it's going to be able to produce it. The second string is complex because the program to print it is basically going to have to say print, quote, we're going to have to type out that string, close quote. So it can't be squeezed, it can't be compressed. And imagine if these strings were, say, 1,000,000 times longer. Well, the program to print the first string would still be very tiny. It would only be a few more bits long than the program to print string 1. It would just say print 0, 1 100 million times. Pretty compact. The second string, if we had a string that was 200 million bits long, and each bit was randomly selected, we would need a program that was at least 200 million bits long, because it would just have to quote the whole string and have to say print and then have that whole string, right? So some information can be really squeezed. There's a pattern and we can squeeze it right down, and some cannot. Some useful terminology in facts about descriptive complexity. Descriptive complexity is objective. You might be thinking, hey, there's different computers or different computer programs, so there's going to be different measures. And that is true, but always within the bound of some finite limit. So if you pick some computer and some computer language, I pick a different computer language, there's going to be some finite bound where my measure of descriptive complexity and yours match. They're under that. The difference between them is within this finite bound. So it is an objective measure. Maximally complex descriptions are said to be incompressible. Also, we can call them Chaitin random. Gregory Chaitin described that form of randomness, and so to distinguish it from other notions of randomness, it's useful to call Chaitin randomness. And here's an interesting fact: most descriptions for any language, any recursive language, are Chaitin random, or very, very, very close to Chaitin random. Insignificantly different from Chaitin random, within a few bits, basically, a Chaitin random. That's a shocking fact. It means you go on, most of the numbers are random, Chaitin random. Any language, most of the sentences of English are Chaitin random, in the sense that you're not going to be able to squeeze them anymore. There's not going to be a pattern in them that allows you to squish them down very much, just a few bits on general. So we sort of obviously ignore that fact. We go around and look for patterns in the world, and we ignore the fact that most things don't, they don't have a compressible, simple pattern within them. What does this have to do with consciousness? Well, I want to ask you, think now. Look at this painting by Pollock. I believe this is Lucifer. Imagine with me for a moment, do a thought experiment. Imagine you have a friend. She's interested in painting, but she's never seen a modern art piece. She's never seen abstract expressionism. She's never seen a painting by Pollock. And you're going to talk to her on the telephone, and you're going to describe for her this painting well enough for her to recreate it. Maybe not perfectly, but well enough to recreate it. So, glancing at it, I think it's Pollock's painting. Well, you and I both know this is a practically impossible undertaking. Why is that? Is that because Pollock's painting is immaterial, it's non-physical, it's emergent on, physical properties, but is not itself a physical property? No, none of these dualist reasons are needed for why our friend's not going to be able to recreate the painting. What's happening is that the painting has a tremendous amount of information in it, visual information in it. And our voice, a telephone line, that's a very low bandwidth channel. And she's on the other end hearing it. It's coming into her, the parts of her brain processing speech. And it's just we're just not built to take all that information, visual information, turn it into oral information, transmit it over this little low bandwidth channel, pick it up, remember it all, and turn that into visual information. We can't do it. So it's the fact that this painting is so complex that makes it, in a way, resistant to that sort of description, right, and transmission and understanding. And my argument is that consciousness itself is like that in general, right? That phenomenal experiences are the ones that we think are mysterious. So we don't tend to think, doing a math problem is mysterious, but we tend to think visual experience or tasting a strawberry is mysterious. So I call that the paradigmatically mysterious phenomenal experiences. Those phenomenal experiences, my claim is, any phenomenal experience E is paradigmatically mysterious if and only if it has some property R that makes it, the kind of experience it is. So such that to explain that phenomenal experience, you're going to have to explain R. And R is very descriptively complex. So I'm not going to talk about it today, but if, I'll give some references at the end. If you look at the canonical arguments that consciousness is irreducible, that it's probably not physical, those arguments all look good if either A, consciousness is non-physical, or B, consciousness is so complex that, we had this intuitive and grasp, but very solid understanding that you're not going to be able to explain it in these low bandwidth channels of speech and theory and so on. All right. That brings us, though, to this sort of back question, more fundamental question. Hey, DeLancey, you had this interesting hypothesis. You defended it in some papers claiming, that phenomenal experiences appear mysterious because they're descriptively complex. But why would they be descriptively complex? Why are these organisms going around with these representational engines that are, generating and storing these very complex representations of the world, and then at the layer of access consciousness, sampling and generating very complex samples of that they use to make behavioral decisions? Why would that happen? And there's two factors we need to explain this. The first is that there's going to be, in general, it's in balance with cost, but there's a fitness benefit driven by competition to high information representation. Again, within the bounds of the fact that it's costly to have representation. Brains are very costly, along with the digestive system, the most costly organ we have, right? So obviously, there's a balance between the fitness benefit and the cost, but they're holding the cost constant. There is an advantage driven by competition to higher information representations. And furthermore, we need to claim that the world itself is very complex. So I'm going to defend both those. First, useful when we think about this evolutionary story to think about competition. So I'm going to talk about camouflage and predation as an example, but we could think of any other kind of competition where representation plays a role in the competition and it would work. But let's think about predation and camouflage. There's this interesting idea that when animals first evolved in the Ediacaran era, this is before the Precambrian era, way back, right, that they were, there were yet no aggressive predators. There were filter feeders, but that was it, right? And some paleobiologists have described this as an Eden, like a world before predation. And the animals were quite like plants, right? They were just sort of filter feeders. Most of them were sessile. And it's an interesting idea, right? And the fossil record seems to suggest it. But as you and I know, over millions of years, predators evolved. This is Amylocaris, right? They're thought to be one of the first large predators. It's got eyes. It's locomotive. It's got limbs to grasp prey, right? So now it's got a problem it's got to solve. It's got to locate, move towards, and, attack, kill, consume prey. Eventually its prey is going to start moving away, and it's got to be better and better at this task. And in fact, one of the big issues is that, as this task progresses and the competition goes on over time, as camouflage evolved is an interesting example. So that's just, again, one type of a competition that needs representation. But you think about camouflage, right? The prey organism has an advantage for better camouflage. So, it's there's evolutionary pressure for the camouflage to improve. And the predatory organism has an advantage to being able to distinguish camouflage from the environment that it's, that the organism is pretending to be part of, right? It's pretending to be a tree or whatever it's pretending to be. And so there's a cycle here where, you can improve the camouflage, or you can improve the the amount of perceptual information that's coming in, and also you can improve the sampling of that information so that you make better decisions. But then, the response to that could be to improve camouflage. And as you and I know, that can become extraordinary, right? Organisms now have just very impressive camouflage, and you got to be sharp-eyed, as we would say, right? That is to say, you need to have very high information perception of the environment, and then high information sampling to drive behavior to go catch that octopus and eat it, right? So again, of course, there are costs of representation, very high costs. So it's not that, you can have boundless increase in representation, but within the bounds of that cost in this competitive environment, there's a benefit to more perceptual information being gathered, but more high information sampling of that perceptual information. Well, wait a minute, DeLancey. Couldn't it be that the world, though, is only so complex and not much more complex? And so, once my representations are good enough, I can stop, right? I don't think so. I'm going to make this is my final claim today, and it's a metaphysical claim, and it might be of interest to you in your own research. Let me know if it is. But the claim is, I'm going to claim the world is information dense. Now, I'm coining this term information density, and the idea is that the information density of something is the amount of energy or matter required to describe it completely, relative to the amount of matter or energy that goes into the object, constitutes the object or event. So let me suppose you're sitting at a table. How well could you describe that table for me? How much matter and energy would it take to store that description? Of course, you can do a trivial description. You can tell me how tall, wide, deep it is, and I could recreate that table. But it would just, at best, I would have something with the same surface area as your table, right? It wouldn't be your table. So how much information would you have to give me for me to recreate an exact duplicate of that table? And if the amount of information is so great that the storage demands of that information approach the mass of the table itself, like the mass required to store that information approaches the mass of the table itself, now we're getting to we're approaching an information density of 1. By the way, if the world is information dense, footnote here, this is an argument against all the simulation arguments. You're probably familiar with this. Many arguments that say that we're living in a simulation. They all depend upon the implicit assumption that the world is not information dense, and so that you can have this computer sitting somewhere and it can simulate the entire universe. But if the universe is information dense, you're going to need as much matter as is in the universe, as much energy as is in the universe, at least to simulate it with accuracy. End of footnote. So I'm going to make the claim, again, definition though, an object would be maximally information dense if the information density is greater than or equal to 1, right? And I'm going to make the claim, I got a weak and a strong claim, either is sufficient. The weak claim is that many objects or events are nearly maximally information dense. And the strong claim would be that all objects or events are maximally information dense. I think that might be true for metaphysical reasons, because my suspicion is that, well, wait a minute, if you needed less information to describe this absolutely without loss, this particular object, I'm not sure why it is the object it is. But anyways, I'm not defending that claim. I'm just saying that, between the weak and the strong claim, the weak claim is sufficient. Sufficient for what? Well, it's sufficient for us to say that there's really going to be no physical, I wrote here practical, but I should have said physical upper limit to the complexity of the information required to distinguish any two arbitrary structures. There are going to be practical limits for organisms in that there's a cost to representation, of course, right? But there's no sort of physical limit in the world, like, oh, you know, you've hit maximum information, things don't get more complex than this. You could have larger objects, right, for example. And that's going to mean there's no, and again, I should have said physical, there's going to be no physical upper limit to the potential for competition of a representational ability between organisms. You know, the camouflage can keep getting better, and then the amount of information required to distinguish between the prey and the thing is trying to pretend it is tree or coral reef or whatever. The amount of information that you can use could grow indefinitely. Again, I shouldn't have said practical because there are practical limits in that. Brains are costly, right? At some point, it wouldn't be worth it. But there's not going to be any physical limit to it. So we put this together that the world is, let's say the weak information density claim and the recognition that competition between organisms that do have representational systems leads to benefits to ever more information in their perception and ever more information in their perception sampling. And we see there's no, in principle, limit to the amount of information that organisms could be gathering from the environment and could be sampling in their consciousness. And that's why, in fact, we should expect consciousness to be enormously information dense, enormously complex. And given that, it's going to appear mysterious to us. And so our question should be, gosh, maybe it's Occam's razor, maybe it's a simpler explanation that it's actually a physical phenomenon, but an enormously complex one as opposed to our non-physical alternative theories. Although, of course, I recognize that's, Occam's razor isn't proof. It could be that dualism is true. I want to close with one warning here. You may be thinking, wait a minute, DeLancey, I got this friend, he's in the physics department. He's got this textbook. He tells me that, all the physical laws that we need are in this textbook. Isn't that textbook, all I need? Isn't the information in that textbook all the information? And from that textbook, I can derive everything I need. So in other words, isn't there an upper limit here? And the answer is no. And the reason is because of a theorem I call the complexity cost principle. It's just a theorem I came up with. It's just a variation of a common theorem in descriptive complexity. Here's the complexity cost principle theorem. If a description D is very much more complex than a theory T, then D cannot be identified as a consequence of T without the additional information, at least as great as the difference between the complexity of your theory and the description. So it's a no free lunch principle. You can prove this, pretty straightforwardly in logic. And what the theorem tells us is that, even if we had the complete physical theory, the arrangements of things in the world is itself a kind of complexity. And so you can't, to derive that complex physical phenomenon from your physical theory, you got to add to your physical theory information. And you're going to have to add as much information basically as is in the proper description of that phenomenon. So, maybe physicalism is true and a compact physical theory is sufficient, and in the sense that physicists will probably mean it complete, but that doesn't mean that from it you can derive the complex phenomenon. No, you need extra information. And again, that's provable. So there shouldn't be any controversy about that. If you're interested, here are some references to papers in which I do defend the complexity of consciousness theory, right? The idea that this tells us why consciousness is mysterious. And I'll stop there. I want to, thanks for watching this video. I look forward to, doing this sort of strange COVID conference that we're all doing and watching some of your videos. And hopefully we can all have some conversations. It's not like being there in Tucson, is it? But it's, next best thing, I guess. So thanks very much for your time. I really do appreciate it. I know you get a lot of other things to do. And please don't hesitate to write me. If you Google me, I'm the only correct DeLancey. If you have any questions, and because I'd love to get feedback and see if my ideas are useful to anyone else, or if you think your ideas might be useful to me. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kao-Cheng Huang from Dharma Academy. I'm very happy to attend this online conference. Today, I'm going to share with you my presentation. The topic is Karmic Spacetime in Consciousness. Karmic Spacetime in Consciousness. This presentation is going to introduce a new paradigm for space and time in the perspective of karma. Before I start, we can think about clone animals. If we clone one animal into 10, all of these clone animals will not have the same life. Although they have the same genes, they do not have the same karma, and therefore they have different life. So what is karma? In the first part of my presentation, I will give you the definition of karma. And then in the second part, I will share with you the differences between karmic spacetime and the physical spacetime. In the third part, I will explain how karmic spacetime is generated. Then I will wrap it up and make a conclusion. To begin with, I will explain the definition of karma. Karma refers to a spiritual driving force that creates a cycle of cause and effect. The cause is our intentions and the actualization of intentions. The effect is our future experience that is shaped by our intentions and the actualizations. Karma works like a boomerang. Whatever we give out, we will receive them back again. If we blame others, we receive blame from others later. If we help others, we receive help from others later. And that is like ebb and flow in the universe. We always receive what we give out before. And that is how a boomerang works. And that is how karma works. Also, karma is continuous, like a river, passing from previous life to this life and then to next life. If we think about identical twins, for the identical twins, although they have the same genes, their consciousness and development are not only shaped by their genes, but may also be molded by their karma. In other words, they have different intentions and different behaviors, therefore they have a very different future experience. That's the first part I want to share with you about the definition of karma. If you agree with me, now I am going to move to the second part, the differences between karmic and physical spacetime. I would like to share with you 3 differences between them. The first difference: physical spacetime is an objective entity. We all learn this from school that there is an objective frame for space and there is an objective flow for time. By contrast, karmic spacetime is different. in the perspective of karma, space-time is a dream-like illusion projected in our consciousness. If we think about a drunk driver, when a drunk driver is driving his car on the road, his brain tells him that he is driving in straight manner, but other cars behind him will not agree that he is driving straight forward. That's the difference between physical space-time and karmic space-time. One is objective and the other is subjective. The second difference, the change of physical space-time is visible. We can see the difference, so we can observe it, and we can also use some equipment to measure the difference. On the other hand, karmic space-time is invisible. We cannot see it, but we can feel it. If our life has some difficulties, or if we have some hardship, we feel like we are staying in an invisible jail. We feel that we are under oppression, or we have very high pressure, and we feel panic. We cannot find the way out of this invisible jail. So we have a very difficult time. That's the second difference. For the third difference, from Einstein's theory of relativity, space and time are not rigid. They are changeable. For example, length construction, time dilation, the curvature of space-time. All of these tell us that space-time is subject to the speed or to the force of gravity. But karmic space-time is different. Karmic space-time is subject to our mental qualities. If we have good intentions, or if we have positive feelings, then we feel more relaxed, and we seem to have more freedom. We are enlarging our karmic space-time. If we don't have positive intentions, or if we have negative feelings, then we feel like we are falling into quicksand. The room around us becomes smaller and smaller. We lose our freedom gradually, and we will get all sorts of negative feelings, and we maybe feel upset because our karmic space-time is shrinking. It's becoming smaller and smaller. If we cannot change our mental qualities, then we will find it very difficult to escape from this quicksand. In these three differences, we notice that karmic space-time is a subjective illusion. It is also an invisible subjective force. Also, it is subject to our mental qualities. If you are on the same page with me, now I'm going to move to the third part of my presentation. I will explain how karmic space-time is created. Karmic space-time is generated from our own ego. everyone has different ego. Ego operates unconsciously in the mode of sin and ignorance, because ego is only interested in itself, not the rest of the world. It is a subjective bias. We can treat it as the source of selfishness because it always goes with self-love, self-interest, and self-centeredness. If we use our ego to perceive an object, then various of sensations will appear, such as joy, happy, annoyed, angry, or crazy, etc. And we tend to follow the sensations we feel comfortable, and we always ignore the negative part. Therefore, blind spots will be created in our perception, and we find it easier for us to see our advantages, and we find it difficult to see our shortcomings. Also, it's easier for us to see the mistakes from others, and difficult for us to see the mistakes for ourselves. Finally, we lose the whole picture of reality. Let's think about a couple. If a husband and a wife do not have good relationships, if they don't want to listen to each other, then even though their physical distance is very close, they are in their respective blind areas, so they will find it very difficult to communicate to each other unless they enlarge their karmic space-time, unless they remove their own blind areas. They will find it difficult to recover their relationships. That is the third part of my presentation. So I already shared with you the definition of karma and the differences between karmic and physical space-time. Also, I have explained how karmic space-time is generated. Now I'm going to wrap it up and give you a conclusion. When we fall asleep, everything appears in our dream is a projection of our subconsciousness, and that is the base for karmic space-time. We used to think that dream is virtual and the sobriety is real, but for our subconsciousness, there is no boundary between dream and sobriety. This means karmic space-time exists in our dream, and it also exists when we awake. So, if we can break the boundary between dream and the sobriety, or if we can identify the operation of our karmic space-time, then we will be able to approach the eternity of reality. This will end my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, you are very welcome to contact me. Thank you very much again. Goodbye.
Hi, I'm Sid Lamb. I'm Professor Emeritus of Linguistics and Cognitive Sciences at Rice University. I'm speaking on support for idealism from theoretical linguistics, the field of consciousness as a relational network. Why start from language? Well, language, for all its seeming complexity, is more amenable to analysis than other cognitive structures. So investigation of language is one of the best ways to proceed to an understanding of human mind and nature. Tim Puliu is a former student of mine. The first question is, what is a linguistic system? That's the information system that supports an individual's language processing. Everybody has one. It's different from everyone else's. The big question for linguistic theory is, what does this system consist of? What is its nature? The usual answer is that it's a set of symbols and a set of rules. Set of rules to go with each set of symbols, phonemes, words, lexical items, morphemes, meanings. That answer is faulty. So let's look a little more closely. What is a word? What is a phoneme? What is a morpheme? A morpheme is a meaningful part of a word. In the case of boy, that's a word consisting of one morpheme. So how do we answer questions like this? Well, you have to look at what anything is related to. How is it related? So you take it boy. As a morpheme, it's just one unit. It's represented as three phonemes in sequence. The sequence is shown by the attachment of the lines at the bottom of that triangle. Now, so we're looking at this object boy. We see that it's represented on the one hand as its phonological representation, but it also has a meaning and it has grammatical properties. Now, I want you to focus on that item in the middle, boy. We lay out its relationships. Once the relationships are laid out, that item disappears. Its presence adds no further information to what is in those relationships. In other words, you can remove that symbol that was in the middle without any loss of information. What seemed to be an object is just a connection in a network of relationships. So now we look at the phoneme. What is a phoneme? Well, there's B. On the one hand, it participates in other morphemes like Bob and bed. On the other hand, it has phonological features that represent it. So phonemes are likewise not objects, but just positions in a relational network. This applies also to O and Y. Y, for example, participates in toy. On the other side, they're represented as their phonological features. And on the upper side, we have the meaning and the grammar, just symbolized here by boy and noun. Those represent network structures. They are purely relational. Now let's look at meaning. Meaning is conceptualization. Meanings of all linguistic forms are in our perceptual conceptual systems. So let's look at the meaning of dog. These are perceptual and conceptual properties of dog. What a dog looks like, that's a visual network. What its bark sounds like, an auditory subnetwork. What its fur feels like, a somatosensory subnetwork. All of these are perceptual information. Each one is a subnetwork with many nodes each, interconnected into a larger network, something like this, where each blue circle represents a subnetwork of properties. The A is auditory, what a dog sounds like. The P is the phonological, that's the English representation, dog, D-O-G. M is memories you have of individual dogs that you have known. This, of course, varies from one individual to another. Visual is a very large network of all the visual properties of dogs. And then there's additional information attached to C, such as types of dog. This is information that varies from one speaker to another. Individual dogs that the subject has known. Anatomical features of dogs. Relationships of dogs to cats and other animals. Behavioral properties. These are all relational properties, not objects. What about the grammar? Well, syntax is a network of syntactic instructions. They too are relational. They're involved with sequence, as in just like the sequence of D-O-G, making up dog, or B-O-Y for boy. They're based on categories. They are grammatical categories, and they're derived from conceptual categories, also purely relational. So our conclusion is that the seeming existence of linguistic objects is illusory. What appear to be linguistic objects, like lexical items, phonological units, concepts, and all, have no existence apart from their relationships. All these relationships form a relational network. This is spelled out in greater detail in these two publications of mine. The 2016 is more up to date, and it's available online. Conceptual and perceptual structure and other meaning structures are intimately tied up with the rest of linguistic structure, such that there is no boundary between the grammatical, lexical, and semantic conceptual. In other words, a complete dictionary would include an encyclopedia. This is where language gets us to all of human knowledge. Language and the knowledge system are one system. Meanings of linguistic forms are in our perceptual, conceptual systems. They are in our minds, not in an outside world. We tend to assume that the structure of the perceptual, conceptual system is determined by the real world, but such systems vary from one language to another, and even from one person to another. So we have the concept of the individual mental cosmos. The semological system is encyclopedic. It comprises the conception of the entire cosmos. That's the individual mental cosmos, IMC. Like the rest of language, it is entirely relational, as I have just shown. Internal mental models. These are internal mental models. They represent the entire cosmos. That's what the IMC is. Our talking and thinking is about our mental models. We assume that they represent some external reality. That's an assumption without much support. People usually suppose they are talking about that assumed external reality. So we now come to the next question, the individual linguistic system versus the language, a general system. What is a language? The usual view is that there is such a thing as a language shared by members of a speech community and assumed to be separate from those individuals. That view is illusory. There is no such thing as a language as distinct from the linguistic systems of individuals. Every individual linguistic system is different from every other. There's no such thing as a language as distinct from the linguistic systems of individuals. This is all spelled out in greater detail in my paper, What is a Language?, which you'll find in Selected Writings of Sidney Lamb, 2004. Now we're going to apply that same line of reasoning to the individual cosmic system. We can apply the same line of reasoning to the individual mental cosmos. It could be called also the individual cosmic system. We have seen that the IMC is the semantic conceptual system, which is not separable from the linguistic system. And it's a network of relationships. It has no objects at all. The IMC is the individual's model of the cosmos. So we ask, how are the IMCs of different people related to one another, and how is the IMC related to the cosmos as a whole? As we have seen, we have individual linguistic systems, but there's no language as a separate entity, only the individual linguistic systems. So we apply that same line of reasoning to conceptual systems. We have the individual mental cosmos that each person has, but why should we assume that there is a cosmos as a whole in addition to all those IMCs. We have no actual evidence that there is such a thing as a physical cosmos as distinct. The way Arthur Eddington put it, it is difficult for the matter-of-fact physicist to accept the view that the substratum of everything is of mental character, but no one can deny that mind is the first and most direct thing in our experience, and all else is remote inference. Now, some people might come up with a counter-argument as follows. People have sensory perceptual systems that bring in information about an independent outside world. My response is threefold. Perception is unreliable. We have no evidence that any information at all from perception is reliable. And perception depends entirely on projection. Projection is, for example, you see green on leaves on the tree outside your window. That greenness is in your mental system. It's not in the leaves. The sound of the trumpet sounds like it's out in the orchestra pit, but it's in your auditory system, in your mind, not out there. When you stub your toe, you feel that the pain is in your toe, but it's not there. It is in your mind. Perception is thoroughly dependent on projection. We actually have no evidence at all that any perception is reliable. The only thing we experience directly is our own mental activity. As Jakob von Uexküll put it in his Theoretical Biology, no attempt to discover the reality behind the world of appearance, that is, by neglecting the subject, has ever come to anything, because the subject plays a decisive role in constructing the world of appearance, and on the far side of that world, there is no world at all. The only evidence we get about the world is presented to our minds by our perceptual systems. So the only thing we experience directly is our own mental activity. The perceived externality of the cosmos is illusory. The assumption of an external mental cosmos is mistaken. It is like that of a separate language, as distinct from the linguistic systems of individuals. So life consists of mental activity, that is, traveling the mental pathways in your own personal relational network, a mental system. It's your IMC. The individual mental cosmos. Now, this brings up Chalmers' recent paper, 2019, David Chalmers, Idealism and the Mind-Body Problem. It's available online. He presents a detailed analysis of the varieties and implications of each of three possible versions, micro-idealism, macro-idealism, and cosmic idealism, which I'll define in a moment. All three have challenges to plausibility, but cosmic idealism is less implausible than the other two. Micro-idealism is the thesis that concrete reality is wholly grounded in micro-level mentality, that is, mentality associated with fundamental microscopic entities such as quarks and photons. Macro-idealism is the thesis that concrete reality is wholly grounded in macro-level mentality, that is, in mentality associated with macroscopic, middle-sized entities such as humans and perhaps non-human animals. And then cosmic idealism is the thesis that concrete reality is wholly grounded in cosmic mentality, that is, in mentality associated with the cosmos as a whole, or with a single cosmic entity, such as the universe or a deity. All three possibilities have challenges that render each of them less than plausible, but cosmic idealism is less implausible than the other two, according to Chalmers. The most important challenge to cosmic idealism is what he calls the constitution problem. This is the problem of how cosmic experience can constitute the ordinary macro experiences of subjects like us, the issue of how the cosmic mind constitutes macro minds. I have a proposed solution. It involves separating conscious from unconscious. We have separated conscious minds at the macro level and the collective unconscious at the cosmic level. Subjects like us have limited fields of consciousness. The cosmic mind is outside of our awareness. That is, it is unconscious to subjects like us. It is collective unconscious, a single comprehensive mental system. Everyone's mind is part of it. Therefore, we are all joined at the mental level, but that joining is unconscious to most people. There is one collective mind shared by all. That is the collective unconscious. It is what Chalmers calls cosmic mentality. It is unconscious to ordinary people, therefore outside of awareness. What is conscious is the separated mind. Each separated mind projects and perceives an IMC. What is conscious is that separated mind, the macro level of Chalmers. Each separated mind perceives a world which is assumed to be external. That's because of projection. That's the IMC. And the perception of externality is, as I said, the result of projection. Everyone is different from every other. The reality is that the separation is an illusion resulting from the limited field of consciousness. The reality is cosmic mentality in which all participate. To reach it, you have to expand the field of consciousness. That's the appeal of psychedelics. And there are other techniques, in the long run more reliable. Spiritual exercises like those of Prather, 1981. Motivation is an important prerequisite. Cosmic mentality can be reached by expanding the field of consciousness, but you have to be motivated to do so. You have to be willing to give up illusions, especially the illusion of separateness. That means relinquishment of individuality and willingness to join cosmic mentality. Our minds are part of the cosmic mind anyway. Thanks for your attention. Now I have some references. You can click on pause if you want to look at more detail. And that's it. We can stop the recording.
Dear audience, before I start, I would like to say something about the reason for this lecture, the purpose of it. Professor Penrose has contended that at a deeper level of description, the quantum mechanical choices for outcomes of orchestrated objective reductions may more accurately arise as a result of some presently unknown non-computational mathematical physical, that is Platonic realm theory. It would be very interesting to understand what elements or principles we would need to arrive at such a theory for the choices, for the selections of orchestrated objective reduction outcomes. What would be sufficient? An important principle from Professor Penrose is we have access to the Platonic world through our ability to be aware of things. If we were simply mindless computers, we would not have that ability. Now in my presentation, I would like to discuss this further. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give a talk on how in the Penrose-Hameroff paradigm, the forms of space-time curvatures can be connected with the eternal Platonic ideas or forms in the qualia of our experiences and choices. My name is Gerard Blommestijn, and in fact, it is about the current shift in our view on brain processes. Originally, we had the brain process, the view on it from classical physics point of view, or still we have that, but now there is a shift has started to the quantum mechanical, indeterministic and non-local entanglement view. And this shift of paradigm is mainly centered around the Penrose-Hameroff paradigm that plays a crucial role in it. And then we look at that paradigm and see that the most important ingredient is there the objective reduction process, the orchestrated objective reduction process. And important thing is, the statement about it is each OR event, orchestrated objective reduction event, is a self-selection out of quantum mechanically superposed space-time geometries, coupled to the brain via microtubules and other biomolecules. And we come later back to this. But first, we look at another aspect of the Hameroff-Penrose paradigm, namely that each instantaneous and non-computable orchestrated objective reduction or self-collapse is equated with a discrete conscious event, a perception or a choice. So every OR is a conscious event. And I like always to look at this in the way that the outcome of the orchestrated objective reduction is a free choice of the ontologically independent consciousness essence, the eye of the mind, that which experiences, not to be confused with the conscious experiences themselves. It is what John von Neumann defined as the abstract ego. Well, he was shifting the cut between observed and observing portions of reality to the last possibility, namely between the brain and the abstract ego. Now, when we look at this non-computable aspect of OR, it has a connection with the Platonic realm that Roger Penrose has contended that at the deeper level of description, the choices, the outcomes of the OR, may more accurately arise as a result of some presently unknown, non-computational, mathematical, physical, it is Platonic realm theory. And it has to do with the subject of Platonic forms, Platonic ideas. For instance, a mathematical idea like the circle. There is a Platonic idea. All the points at the same distance from a central point, that forms a circle. That can be recognized by us as the mathematical idea, the concept. And we also have a lot of other Platonic ideas, like color of the circle and the radius of the circle. But let's first dive into the world of eternal Platonic ideas or forms. Here we see Plato and his famous allegory of the cave. And in this cave, there are poor prisoners, and they look at shadows that are cast on the wall, because there are people that are, so they are called the showmen, and they have puppets, and they perform something with these puppets, of which we see the shadows on the wall, because there is a fire burning behind these showmen. And so behind the reality as we perceive it, the shadows cast on the wall, there are ideas or forms or concepts, and those are the puppets of the showman. For example, we see a multitude of beautiful things and good things, but we also assume the existence of beauty and goodness, which we could call the essence of each. And these are the thinkable ideas, the first principles, also called forms. So everywhere it is synonymous, the ideas and the forms. Now, we have different types of them. By the way, Whitehead called them eternal objects, these Platonic ideas. For instance, Plato himself mentions even and odd numbers, 3 kinds of angles, square, diagonal, the 5 regular polyhedra, as we see here. and a circle, but we have all kind of things, rotation in itself in all its forms, and all of mathematics, in fact, are Platonic ideas. And it works in the sense that every perceived circle is a manifestation of the abstract circle. Now we have other types of ideas, for instance, in the domain of character, virtue, aesthetics, like you have justice, value, goodness, courage, beauty, but also imperfections and negative properties. And then you have ideas related to the classification of things, a human, a house, a horse, an elephant, a plant, all these things that are in the animal and plant kingdoms, tables, colors, movements, of everything there are Platonic forms. And now Professor Penrose explains it beautifully in his small book, The Large, the Small and the Human Mind. He says, you show a child different numbers of objects as in the figure. Then you say, for instance, one object of one of each object, or two or three or four of each object. And after a while, the child can abstract the notion of natural number from them. And then he writes, I would say that the child is able to make some kind of contact with the Platonic world of mathematics. Somehow these natural numbers are already there, existing somewhere in the Platonic world, and we have access to that world through our ability to be aware of things. If we were simply mindless computers, we would not have that ability. So awareness is essential for access to the Platonic ideas. This works in the following way. You can say the system is, you have forms or ideas, they are a universal template in the Platonic world, in this outside space-time, and they you could say go on an adventure in the real world, the manifestation of an idea, the particular circle, for instance. But when you then see look in the other direction, this in space-time a circle, you can abstract from that the abstract circle, the mathematical principle of it. Well, we have all kinds of experiences, and one type is the rational experiences, rational perceptions, such as mathematical understanding and reasoning, and also in physics, for instance, recognizing a harmonic oscillator, also in other sciences, and also the understanding and reasoning in other fields, for instance, recognizing the motives that living beings have for things. And then we have the ideas behind these rational experiences. They are the elements, the primitives, the letters, as it were, that compose the phrases of the total understanding complex in this rational perceptions world. And that is part of the orchestrated objective reduction for a human being that has a mathematical understanding of the natural numbers, for instance. And then we have also other types of perceptions, because rational perceptions, then sensory perceptions, they also have their ideas, their elements, such as colors, shapes, tones, sounds, tactile experiences, etc. And we have emotional perceptions, feelings. They also have their ideas as templates, like fear, pride, etc. So the qualia in all our perceptions, perception modalities, the different types, are manifestations of ideas or forms. Then we have not only one-way traffic between the neurons and the abstract ego, not only perceptions from the abstract ego, so the abstract ego does not only have perceptions. So from the processing in the brain, we get the last step to that with experiences, to the eye of the mind, but we also have choices, decisions, plans from the abstract ego to the brain. And those choices, like decisions, action plans, desires, wishes, and both mental and physical, have also their enormous amounts of Platonic ideas. For instance, in this choice world, we have the idea of living a loving world, which is clearly a Platonic idea that happily goes on adventures everywhere in reality. So altogether, these slides that you have seen now is a grand generalization of the Platonic ideas. And in the original neurosciences, without quantum mechanics, we always had the neural correlates of consciousness. That was interneuron, so it has to do with only with firing and synapses. But now with quantum mechanics, you look into the neurons to biomolecules, like for instance microtubules, and then you have an orders of magnitude, much more detail and nuance for encoding the experiences and the choice plans. And then these experience and choice plans, when we remember the first slide, are orchestrated objective reduction self-selections from quantum mechanically superposed space-time geometries. Now we look at a scheme that is often shown in this respect within the Penrose-Hameroff paradigm. We have then superposition of two space-time curvatures, and they, here it is drawn together in one figure as this superposition of it. So one of these curved space-time geometries is selected in such an orchestrated objective reduction. Now, how does this work? Probably in the Penrose-Hameroff paradigm, it is said that the van der Waals forces, the London van der Waals forces between nearby benzene rings make interaction pathways, and so that is kind of changing the positions of the masses in the microtubules, in the tubulin protein. And John Archibald Wheeler says so nicely, space-time tells matter how to move, and matter tells space-time how to move, how to curve. So the places, the positions of these atoms, these nuclei also, and the electrons, they tell space-time how to curve. So we get then an enormously complex space-time geometry, but it is in fact the outcome of an OR, and that is also a neural correlate of consciousness, because that represents exactly what the living being feels, what he understands, sees, plans, etc. at that moment. Now, in everything that the living being experiences and chooses, we can abstract its Platonic ideas. We have seen that a few slides before. And by the way, I consider mathematical understanding as a rational experience with its own qualia. For all the experience and choice modalities, you have Platonic ideas. They get a manifestation in the experiences and choices in space-time with their physical side, the space-time curvatures. And in the other direction, you have abstraction to Platonic ideas. And every aspect is filled of the experiences and the choices of all the different modalities, is totally full with Platonic ideas. The physical side of all the experiences and choices is the space-time geometry that is the result of the orchestrated objective reduction. So then, isn't it obvious that the physical side is written in the language of the ideas? Each idea has its own specific space-time curvature shape. So then we get the following picture. It is in fact, the assertion of this talk, that each Platonic form, also called idea then, is related to its specific space-time geometry form and vice versa. So the highly complex space-time curvature geometry that is selected in an orchestrated objective reduction, that has to represent all the experiences and choices of a living being at that moment in some coded form. And this representation may be such that the shape of a detailed part of the space-time geometry is related to the associated Platonic idea, such as a certain mathematical insight, a certain color, a certain sound, feeling, plan, etc., etc. Our entire perception and choice total is then encoded in very specific forms of space-time curvatures, connected, every one, to a Platonic idea, of which they are the manifestations. So the Platonic forms manifest as curved space-time forms, probably in a language-like way, as letters, words, sentences, paragraphs, chapters of all these space-time forms. All is stories told in the language of the ideas. A kind of summary, an orchestrated objective reduction is a conscious event with manifestations of all involved Platonic ideas in all perception and choice modalities, coded in their space-time curvature geometries. For example, the mathematical understanding and reasoning of a person at a particular point in time consists of the combination of all the Platonic ideas involved in the separate parts of the whole understanding. So the implied Platonic ideas in all their togetherness make up a person's total understanding. Therefore, we must conclude that mathematical understanding is entirely based on the content of the Platonic ideas, the essences they represent. They just need to be recognized, to be seen. Understanding is then just as direct as having a sensory perception. For instance, the color red of an object we see is directly present in our perception. It is a manifestation of the Platonic idea red, in the same way for all other perception and choice modalities, such as rational perception, the mathematical understanding. Consciousness, the abstract ego, has direct access to the Platonic ideas, of which our perception and choice is the manifestation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, this is Michael Silverstein, Professor of Philosophy at Elizabethtown College and the University of Maryland, College Park. And I am recording this instead of doing a video, so you won't have to look at me. Hopefully it'll go over better than watching comedians give jokes to empty rooms. I'll do my best to make it as engaging and dramatic as possible. The title of my talk is Jamesian Neutral Monism, All of the Perks of Panpsychism with None of the Headaches. It's a pretty subtle title, but hopefully the nuances will come through. So there's going to be weird pauses because you have to wait for the recording to kick in on every slide. At any rate, this is a slide of my most recent book. If you're looking to dive into details, this would be the place to go. These are further developments from the book, which came out in 2018, where you can get even more nuances and details. I'll be happy to send these to anybody who asks for them. Here's an overview of the talk. 2 parts. 1, what is panpsychism and why it's problematic? And 2, what is neutral monism and why it's distinct and superior to panpsychism? I told you it was subtle. Let's begin by defining panpsychism. Panpsychism holds that whatever the fundamental entities or processes of physics are, their intrinsic nature is some sort of proto-qualia, proto-consciousness, or proto-subjectivity. That is, what it's like to be. It's important to understand that this is the very defining essence of panpsychism. There are a lot of views out there that go by the name of panpsychism that violate these conditions in one way or another. I would say they're not really panpsychism. And there's a lot of people who confuse panpsychism with other views, such as the one I'm about to defend, called neutral monism. At any rate, semantics aside, this is the target for the next few minutes. Continuing with defining panpsychism. People often say that panpsychism is a kind of monism. However, panpsychism holds that what is fundamental is both inherently physical and mental. Panpsychism and its variants, pan-proto-psychism, etc., holds that mental and physical properties are both dependent on each other in some way. Panpsychism, therefore, is at best a dual-aspect monism, which is really just another kind of property dualism. What are the motivations for panpsychism? I would say, well, this list is no means exhaustive. Here are some of the major motivations. 1, the sense that it's a better option than strong emergence. 2, the sense that it most preserves physicalist or ontological reductionist intuitions. 3, the sense that it's the only option for those naturalists who want to reject the primary-secondary property distinction. And 4, the sense that it provides an intrinsic essence for matter. So let me talk briefly about these for a moment. If you want to see me engage in a much more in-depth critique of panpsychism, you can go back and read those papers that I listed on the second slide. So for now, I'm just trying to give you my mindset, why I'm making the argument for neutral monism. So let's talk about number 1 first, the sense that it's a better option than strong emergence. Obviously, this is a value judgment. I would say they're both poor options. And the fact that the best argument for either is that it might be better than the other is a pretty compelling reason to look for an alternative. And that's what neutral monism provides. 2, the sense that it most preserves physicalist or ontological reductionist intuitions. I'm deeply puzzled by this claim, and I'm also puzzled by, relatively speaking, how popular panpsychism has become as an option, especially for people who think of themselves as having a physicalist or ontological reductionist bent. After all, one standard way of defending physicalism is that nothing mental can be fundamental. Panpsychism certainly violates that. The idea here seems to be that this is the physicalist credo. Whatever is fundamental must be physics or in fundamental physics. So if we decide that consciousness, subjectivity, doesn't reduce or can't be identified with the physical or the neurobiological, then we'll just have to stick it in fundamental physics. But I find this reasoning problematic for a number of reasons. A, I obviously have no great love of physicalism or ontological reductionism. But even if you did, to be told, suppose that you were told that fairies exist. You're a good naturalist and you've now learned that fairies exist. But then you've been told not to worry because there are actually elements of fundamental physics. It turns out that some of the particles are fairies. It's not clear to me why that should make anyone feel better about if one is a naturalist, about the ontological status of fairies or about physics. I would say that it only makes them both weirder and more puzzling. I would say that the reality is that both panpsychism and strong emergence are simply just violations of the physicalist or ontological reductionist intuitions. You could stick that violation on the scale of brains or information processing systems, if you like, or you can stick that violation on the Planck scale or the pre-geometric scale or whatever you like. But they're both problematic violations. They both raise similar questions about how the mental and the physical interact, etc. 3. The sense that it's the only option for naturalists who want to reject the primary-secondary property distinction. As I will argue, there is another option. It's called neutral monism. And I think that neutral monism is an even more complete and powerful rejection of the primary and secondary property distinction. Again, panpsychism simply says that what's fundamental has both physical and mental aspects, and they both depend on each other in some way. Depending on the nature of that dependence relation, for example, suppose you don't think there's any such thing as free-floating qualia. Suppose you think that there is some sort of proto-subjectivity and there's no qualia without subjects, even in fundamental physics. Then that's certainly not a rejection of the primary and secondary property distinction. You just moved it to a different scale. 4, the sense that it provides an intrinsic essence for matter. Of course, you have to be convinced that matter needs an intrinsic essence. You could just do what I do, which is acknowledge that given all the contextuality theorems in quantum mechanics, given what we've learned about space and time, space-time and relativity, etc., maybe one ought to question the idea that matter, or at the very least particular tokens of matter, like every particle or entangled state or what have you, must have some essence, some intrinsic essence. Problems for panpsychism. I'm just going to rehearse what I think are the standard problems. I'm certainly not going to add any nuances to these problems in this talk because it's not the purpose of this talk. But I will say, at least for me, I've seen no compelling resolution to these problems. The first one is that there's no empirical reason to believe it's true. In other words, there's nothing about our observations of fundamental physics that suggests, other than in the most metaphorical sense that, admittedly, some physicists and philosophers have noted, that fundamental physical entities have anything like subjectivity. And the way you know that that's the case is that you never need to invoke qualia or subjectivity, etc., in order to explain or understand their behavior. Unlike, for example, organisms, animals, etc. Second problem. Various combination problems. I will not rehearse them all. We're all familiar with them. Third problem, and it's related to the second, the ambiguity. There is a pan-proto-psychism. In other words, there's a dilemma that panpsychism faces. They can try to claim that fundamental physical entities have a robust kind of consciousness or subjectivity. That only makes the no empirical reason problem get much worse, because again, there's absolutely no reason to believe that it's true based on observation. Or they can go the other direction and try to make whatever sort of consciousness or subjectivity fundamental physical entities have very proto, totally unlike anything we associate with conscious experience. But if they do that, they make the second problem true. They make the second problem worse. Indeed, pan-proto-psychism, and the more proto it is, the worse it is, threatens to turn combination problems into a generation problem. So it's a dilemma. And either horn of the dilemma is, I would say, devastating for panpsychism. I don't think that's changed. Another objection, which some may find a virtue, is that it would seem to render subjectivity epiphenomenal. So yes, you have something like proto-qualia or what have you, in the center of physical entities, but they don't do anything, as it were, other than lend intrinsic essence to physical entities. Finally, I'm not going to spend any real time developing this objection, but one might argue that panpsychism threatens to collapse into idealism. After all, we standardly conceive of the essential properties of a thing as being those that are intrinsic. So if panpsychism claims that the intrinsic properties of material entities are mental or consciousness, then panpsychism starts to look a lot more like idealism than a real alternative. So, let's move on and look at another possibility. And I think it's really important to define a neutral monism at length. And forgive me, I'm going to be anally quoting key historical figures who defended neutral monism. And I think it's important to do this not only to fully characterize the position, but also to make it clear that neutral monism is really a distinct position from any brand of panpsychism. People often confuse this, and they often use the language of neutral monism, or they call neutral monism panpsychism, or panpsychism neutral monism, or whatever. And of course, all this is exacerbated by the fact that historically, figures like Russell and James held a variety of different positions going by these sorts of names. And I will talk about James and Russell at length going forward. But I just want to make clear for now, neutral monism is a different position. And here's what it holds. In its most general form, mental and material features are real, but in some specified sense reducible to or constructible from a neural basis in a non-eliminative sense of reduction. This neutral basis should not be conceived as a substance. Mental and material features are not separable or merely correlated. They are non-dual. Indeed, they are not essentially different and distinct aspects. Continuing defining neutral monism. Now, what I want to do is give you some quotes from William James, he's in the title, and also Bertrand Russell. Because again, even though Russell has defended many positions, including a relatively popular position people often call Russellian monism, he also defended and articulated, I think beautifully, neutral monism proper. So I'll be quoting from him and James going forward. Here's the first quote. I think it's really important, even though it's perhaps overkill to quote from these people so much. I think it's important because historically, this is where, at least recently in the West, this idea most recently took hold. And also I think that these figures do a really good job of trying to bring out what the idea is. So, first quote from James. Things and thoughts are not fundamentally heterogeneous. They are made of one and the same stuff. Stuff which cannot be defined as such, but only experienced, and which one can call, if one wishes, the stuff of experience in general. Subjects knowing, things known, are roles played, not ontological facts. Here's another quote, this one from Russell. Very similar idea. The whole duality of mind and matter is a mistake. There is only one kind of stuff out of which the world is made, and this stuff is called mental in one arrangement and physical in the other. So what I want to do going forward is deepen the idea. I realize that in many ways, this is a hard idea for people to wrap their head around. And I think, and you can see that historically in the reaction that James got in his attempt to try to push this particular alternative to panpsychism and materialism and etc. And I think it's clear the reason that it's so hard for people to appreciate this idea is not because it's complex, but because we very much have built into our psyche a kind of dualism about the mental and the physical. And it's very hard to transcend that. Okay, continuing. Here are some quotes from James. Again, I hope that one of these quotes works like a koan and a light bulb goes off in the listener, and this starts to be appreciated as a plausible alternative to dual aspect theories, materialism, panpsychism, etc. So here's the first quote. Subjectivity and objectivity are affairs not of what an experience is aboriginally made of, but of its classification. Second quote. Subjects knowing, things known are roles played, not ontological facts. Third quote. The neutral in itself is no more inner than outer. It becomes inner by belonging to an inner. It becomes outer by belonging to an outer world. Continuing. A little longer passage from James. A given undivided portion of experience, taken in one context of associates, plays the part of the knower or a state of mind or consciousness, while in a different context, the same undivided bit of experience plays the part of a thing known, of an objective content. In a word, in one group it figures as a thought, in another group as a thing. Continuing, William James again. My thesis is that if we start with the supposition that there is only one primal stuff or material in the world, and don't read stuff too literally as substance, a stuff of which everything is composed, and of which we call that stuff pure experience, the knowing can easily be explained as a particular sort of relation towards one another into which portions of pure experience may enter. The relation itself is part of pure experience. One of its terms becomes the subject or bearer of the knowledge, the knower, the other becomes the object known. Now, a couple things to say in order to avoid pitfalls. James is not selling any sort of kind of substance, even though he used words like stuff and composition. Don't take those words too literally. More importantly, he unfortunately, as does Russell sometimes, uses terms like pure experience or the field of experience that immediately suggest to us sense data theory or idealism or what have you. If it isn't clear now, it will be clear, I hope, going forward, that that's not at all what James has in mind. Sense data theories, obviously, and idealism, obviously, are on the mentalistic side of things. And that's exactly what James is rejecting, along with materialism. So James's famous essay, Does Consciousness Exist? At the time, and I would say it's probably still true, is often interpreted as a sort of eliminativism or behaviorism or what have you. But that's not at all what James is saying. What James is doing is rejecting a particular conception of consciousness of the sort that gets reified when we talk about things like qualia, especially if we talk about free-floating qualia that somehow exist independently of subjects or subjectivity. So here I'm just showing you the idea, which I will unpack. So what we have, the neutral is what James calls pure presence. More on that shortly. Pure presence manifests as knower and known. Those are strictly relational. And the idea is to explain why that bifurcation persists and why that leads us into believing, therefore, that the mental and the physical are essentially distinct. So the idea is that the world, the claim that the world is carved at the joints, all of physical, mental, inner, outer, subject, object, etc., is not a datum, but rather an inductive projection. That's the idea James is trying to get across. So the generation problem, how and when is consciousness generated, and the hard problem, these are cognitive illusions. Again, be careful. This is not the claim that consciousness is an illusion. Only a particular conception is a cognitive illusion. So experience isn't inherently or essentially mental, and the external world isn't inherently non-mental. So the key idea of neutral monism is that, as many people have noted recently, when Galileo and others reified a primary-secondary distinction, and of course, one can add other reifiers such as Descartes, many, many others, then we got locked into this idea that there is this generation problem, this hard problem, this mind-body problem, and it leads us down all kinds of, it leads us to materialism and the identity theory and panpsychism and strong emergence and all sorts of views that are deeply problematic. And I would say the reason those views are all deeply problematic and deeply flawed is because they're all just patches on materialism or physicalism or ontological reductionism. They're not really willing to fully embrace that this problem starts with a fundamental mistake. This idea of neutral monism is certainly much older than anywhere you find it in Western philosophy. In fact, Evan Thompson notes that the idea can be found in Yogacara Buddhism. And I have written papers arguing that you can find the idea even earlier in Advaita Vedanta Hinduism. Here's what Evan says. I think this quote really, again, brings out the idea of neutral monism. And again, I'm just trying to get the listener to have an epiphany that this is a distinct view that could be true. Here's the quote. Take a moment of visual awareness, such as seeing the blue sky on a crisp fall day. The ego consciousness makes the visual awareness feel as if it's my awareness, and it makes the blue sky seem the separate and independent object of my awareness. In this way, the ego consciousness projects a subject-object structure onto awareness. According to the Yogacara philosophers, however, the blue sky isn't really a separate and independent object that's cognized by a separate and independent subject. Rather, there's one impression or manifestation that has two sides or aspects: the outer seeming aspect of the blue sky and the inner seeming aspect of the visual awareness. What the ego consciousness does is to reify these two interdependent aspects into a separate subject and a separate object. But this is a cognitive distortion that falsifies the authentic character of the impression or manifestation as a phenomenal event. And to be very clear, again, this is not the idea that this is a rejection of representationalism. This is a kind of direct realism. This is about making a particular cut between subject and object in, to use James's language, the field of experience. Now, let me continue to define neutral monism by looking at some of the things that Russell has said, because I think he does a great job expressing and adding to the idea. Here we go. In neutral monism, what we call space-time is nothing but the events therein, and those events are neither inherently mental nor inherently physical. Russell calls such neutral events unstructured occurrences, such as hearing a tire burst or smelling a rotten egg or feeling the coldness of a frog. It sounds like Russell was having a lot of fun. Continuing, quotes from Russell trying to characterize neutral monism. First quote, matter and motion are logical constructions using events as their material, and events are therefore something quite different from matter and motion. As he puts it, it is a mere linguistic convenience to regard a group of events as states of a thing, or substance, or piece of matter, or a precept. Going even further, he says, electrons and protons are not the stuff of the physical world. Again, bits of matter are not among the bricks out of which the world is built. The bricks are events. Bits of matter are portions of the structure to which we find it convenient to give separate attention. So again, this stuff from Russell really brings out that neutral monism is a complete rejection of materialism and physicalist ontological reductionism and of the primary-secondary property distinction. So the idea here is that the world is not made up of things like electrons or atoms or the wave function or quantum loops or whatever you would like. Those things are rather expressions of the neutral. And I would even go farther and say it's worth considering the possibility that what we in philosophy of physics call beables, which are supposed to be precisely those things that are behind appearances or observations, such as particles, waves, and fields, are actually not fundamental, but rather they are ways that the neutral behaves in certain physical contexts. The obvious case to think about here, the obvious analogy, if you like, or metaphor, is the twin slit experiment. Is there really both a wave and a particle? Is there really only a wave, etc.? Well, one way to look at what quantum mechanics is telling us, and I would say relativity as well, is that what sort of quote-unquote beable fundamental physical processes behave like depends on, for example, the experimental setup. That's the sort of idea that Russell's going for. Back to James. Let's talk about the fundamental in neutral monism. The neutral base in question is what James calls unqualified actuality and the instant field of the present. I call it neutral pure presence, pure being, or nowness. Philosophers and physicists such as Einstein have long noted that there is something special about the experience of nowness, which is, to quote Einstein, outside the realm of science. Neutral monism, at least the neutral monism that James defends and that I am defending here, holds that this presence is fundamental and universal. To paraphrase Hawking, it's what puts the fire in the equations. Don't misunderstand me. This is not some sort of spotlight theory that metaphysicians often argue for, in which there is some metaphysical spotlight that picks out certain events, say, for example, in a block universe, as being the now or the present moment. No. This is completely fundamental and universal. Presence is that feeling that we all have that there's something special about the now. I'll say more about characterizing it in a minute. So what are the implications for the hard problem or the generation problem for neutral monism? Again, neutral monism is a complete rejection of the primary and secondary property distinction. So, goodbye hard problem. With neutral monism, we do not tell a story about how fundamental quantum or neural processes give rise to full-blooded conscious experience, i.e. panpsychism or strong emergence. So there is no generation problem. What we do in neutral monism is we tell a story that starts with the non-duality of the so-called mental and physical, and then explain why we incorrectly perceive them as essentially distinct. In order to provide that explanation, we first have to appreciate why there appears to be both subjectivity and objectivity, the phenomenology of that experience. And to appreciate what that explanation looks like, you have to think, let's start by thinking about Kant's unity of apperception. And the basic idea there, we all know, is that a minimal subject in a world and space and time go hand in hand. They're two sides of the same coin. You can't have a subject without that objective world in space and time, and vice versa. Now, of course, for Kant, that is going to be a kind of transcendental idealism, and he will invoke the categories and all that. The idea behind neutral monism, James is very explicit about it, in fact, is that Kant is absolutely on the right track, but wrong to invoke categories or transcendental idealism. As James puts it, not subject, not object, but object plus subject is the minimum that can actually be. The subject-object distinction, meanwhile, is entirely different from that between mind and matter and from that between body and soul. Souls were detachable. They had separate destinies. Things could happen to them. So again, James is embracing the unity of apperception, but not sticking it in the head as categories or what have you. Again, subjectivity and objectivity. Unlike Kant's a priori transcendental condition, i.e. the categories, for this object plus subject experience, neutral monism is proposing an a posteriori transcendental condition, not some cognitive lens through which the noumenal is filtered. Rather, neutral monism is a kind of direct realism. As James puts it, as subjective, we say that the experience represents. As objective, we say it is represented. Indeed, there is only the instant field of the present. It is only virtually or potentially either subject or object as yet. For the time being, it is plain, unqualified actuality or existence. A simple that. That's presence. Continuing. So what then is the self or a subject for James? Here's his answer. The individualized self, which I believe to be the only thing properly called self, is a part of the content of the world experience. The world experience comes at all times with our body at its center, center of vision, center of action, center of interest. Where the body is here. Where the body acts is now. What the body touches is this. All other things are there, and then, and that. It is for this reason that, according to radical empiricism, experience as a whole wears the form of a process in time. So the idea that James is talking about here is, I would say, very much in line, at least with certain kinds of extended brands of cognitive science. I'll come back to that idea towards the end. So then, we now have an explanation for subjectivity and objectivity. In other words, for our phenomenological experience. So where does the illusion of duality come in? Why do we get this idea in our head? And remember, your head is, when I say in your head, don't think about that in a Cartesian way. But why do we get the idea that the subjective and the objective are essentially different? That the mental and the physical are essentially different. And we need to somehow address that. James says that the reification of subject and self only arises when a given bit is abstracted from the flow of experience and retrospectively considered in the context of different relations. Relations that are external to the experience taken singly, but internal to the general flow of experience taken as a whole. In other words, it is only the discursive intellect in an inductive act of interpretation that later creates or projects these dualisms between subject and object, inner and outer, self and world. But again, while this does have a neo-Kantian flavor, as I noted, keep in mind that this discursive intellect is not some a priori cognitive category through which noumena is filtered. The mind's inference to the dualism of knower and known, subject and object, etc., happens after the fact, in the mind's attempt to interpret experience. So this is, in this sense, you can easily imagine telling a kind of predictive coding account of this sort of illusion. Again, let me also stress that neutral monism is not unique to the West. It's not unique to phenomenology. You certainly find these ideas, similar ideas, and everywhere in the Neo-Kantian tradition, including Husserl, and obviously James's radical empiricism in the West. But as I said earlier, you can find similar ideas in Asian traditions such as Hinduism and Buddhism. Both those traditions have long noted, for example, that the self, world, subject, object always appear and disappear together. So again, this is a phenomenological claim. And here I'm taking phenomenology seriously. So think about these examples. Going in and out of deep sleep, going in and out of deep meditative states, and certain psychedelically induced states, or so I've been told. You'll find that the subject object, the self and the world, they always come and go together. Two sides of the same coin. So, is neutral monism just another completely philosophical account of the mind-body problem that has no obvious scientific import or support? I think the answer is no. I think that we find neutral monism is well supported, at least by a certain brand of cognitive science. And it needn't even necessarily be a full-blooded, extended, embodied, etc. kind of cognitive science. So, for example, take the researcher of time perception, Mark Whitman, whose work is well known. In his recent book, Felt Time, he says the following things, expressing the same idea. Obviously, I can only give you the quotes here, given the time factor. I'm already way over time. But you can read the books and the experiments involved, why he makes these sorts of claims. First, because I have a body, I perceive the passing of time. Temporal experience, self-consciousness, and the perception of bodily states and feelings are tightly bound to each other. They cannot be experienced separately. Finally, research on consciousness inevitably shows that our concepts of self, time, and body are interrelated. Presence means becoming aware of a physical and a psychic self that is temporally extended. To be self-conscious is to recognize oneself as something that persists through time and is embodied. So there's a great deal of work in cognitive science, many different kinds of cognitive areas of cognitive science, that strongly suggest that Kant was very much onto something about that relation. Now, he was talking about waking state experience, but the dream researcher Jennifer Wendt makes a very similar point about even our experience in dreams, wherein obviously the Kantian ideal is often violated. She notes that even in dreams, phenomenal selfhood, the dream you, requires the experience of a self-world boundary, and phenomenal selves are always spatiotemporally situated, even in dreams. As she states, spatiotemporal self-location is a highly invariant property of phenomenal experience. Though the phenomenal here and phenomenal now, are constantly shifting in dreams, they consistently form the center of the phenomenal world. So in other words, dreams can get really weird in terms of space, time, objecthood, exactly all the sorts of things that Kant gives as categories. But no matter how weird it gets, she notes, based on research from sleep labs, etc., our own phenomenological experience and so on, There is always something like a subject or a self in something like a world. Indeed, what she says is a perfect expression of the kind of neutral monism advocated for here. She says the following: the experience of being in a world only makes sense if we assume that someone, a phenomenal self, is experienced as being located in this world. Phenomenal selfhood requires the experience of a self-world boundary. Phenomenal selves are always situated selves, located at some point in the experienced world and distinguished from other persons or objects in it. They are always firmly located in the present and bear a particular relation to remembered past and anticipated future selves. Spatio-temporal situatedness thus is a plausible candidate not only for identifying the phenomenal core of dreaming, but also for understanding conscious experience and phenomenal selfhood as such. But again, remember, when a neutral monist makes this claim, this is not some sort of virtual reality projection or something in the head or what have you. This is the nature of experience. The self-world complex is irreducible. Evan Thompson makes a similar point in what follows. The feeling of being a distinct self immersed in the world comes back in the dream state. We experience the dream from the perspective of the self within it, or the dream ego. Although the entire dream world exists only as a content of our awareness, we identify ourselves with only a portion of it. The dream ego that centers our experience of the dream and presents itself as the locus of our awareness. Now, what's important about this to note is those people who favor, sometimes they're predictive coding people, but indeed, this might even be the majority of people in consciousness studies, they favor some sort of internalist model of consciousness, that somehow your brain generates the virtual reality, and that virtual reality perhaps bears, and the inductive inferences that go along with it bear certain statistical or predictive relationships to the external world, whatever that is. And of course, those people often invoke dreams as their favorite analogy for what waking state consciousness is, because the idea for them is, look, waking state is just, very much like the dream state. It's just another kind of virtual world with a similar structure. The neutral monist wants to flip that and go, yeah, the dream analogy is actually a great analogy for waking state experience, but it has nothing to do with a virtual world in the brain or representationalism or anything like that. It has to do with the fact that just as in dreams, we often make a division between subject and object, between the dream self or the dream ego or what have you, and whatever weird world is involved, when we, quote unquote, the waking self, looks back on the dream, you can very much see that really there was just one thing there. There was no Dedekind cut between the subjective and the objective. And for those people that take first-person evidence seriously, obviously no amount of experience will ever allow us to determine a particular metaphysical position. Of course, there will always be underdetermination. But I do think it's worth pointing out that I think there's first-person evidence for something like neutral monism. For those people who've had this experience, it'll be a much more believable claim, perhaps. But the idea is this, lots of people pointed this out. In the deepest meditative state, what happens? Eventually, even the subject-object complex or the self-world complex goes away. And what remains in that state is not an I, not a self, not a subject, not an object, not a world, but what remains is what I earlier called pure neutral presence. And of course, that pure neutral presence is always there, even in our waking, ordinary experiences, but one has to get very still to experience it. But it is very much that feeling of the specialness of the now. And in Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, they have a name for the state. It's called Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And yes, to be clear, my Sanskrit is rusty. But the idea is clear enough. There's nothing but being itself. This is just pure being. So I would say neutral monism is philosophically, metaphysically superior. It has the backing of cognitive science and first-person experience. It gives us a very different way to think about the world. And let me be clear, of course, there's nothing about neutral monism that, says that we shouldn't be looking for neural correlates of various conscious experiences. Because there's all kinds of practical reasons. And there's all kinds of correlates. There's informational correlates, chemical correlates, dynamical correlates, etc. And there's much that we're discovering and much to be discovered. I will say this, even when we focus on neural correlates, I think the more that we're learning about the various neural correlates, again, this would be a talk in itself. I can't back this up here, but I think the more we learn about neural correlates of the waking state versus the anesthetized state versus certain psychedelic experiences, deep meditation or whatever, we see that what those states are about are indeed breaking that subject-object complex in one way or another. Removing the self, removing the world, removing them both, etc. Thank you very much for your attention. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or want to continue the conversation.